Thank you, Dean Schill, for that very generous introduction. And I'd also like to thank the Rutter family, not only for this award that they've endowed, but also for all the ways in which they've supported legal education over the years. Thanks also to the selection committee. When I look at the list of my colleagues who have won this award over the years, I'm frankly amazed and honored to have been inducted into their midst. So amazed and honored, I even broke out a tie, which is probably the first time this group of students has seen me in one. And I'd like to thank the students, many of whom are here, many of whom I've gotten to know well in corporate finance and business associations. Their generous evaluations over the years have encouraged me and kept me going, made me think that I was doing something useful. Mike read a number of them. He didn't read what is probably my favorite one of all time, although it was a bit of a double-edged sword. It said, "Professor Bainbridge is my favorite professor of all time. Please tell him to go on a diet because I'm afraid he's going to keel over dead." Finally, I'd like to thank my wife, Helen, who's here and who's been my staunchest support through all these many years. It's interesting to me that I win this award this year because this is my 20th year in legal education. As I stand before you, I am, hopefully, with any luck, halfway through my career as a law professor, maybe 5/8. And I'd like to take advantage of your good nature for a few minutes to reflect a little bit on where I've come over these last 20 years as a teacher and talk about the style of teaching that I've developed and also the subject matter to which I've devoted my professional life. When I joined the Illinois faculty 20 years ago, I thought that I had to aspire to be Professor Kingsfield. I suspect most law professors of a certain age thought that. But Kingsfield never had to teach securities regulation at 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon to a class of third-year students in their last semester of law school. Suffice it to say, it did not go well. Perhaps I lacked a certain gravitas. Perhaps I was too cherubic for my own good. Perhaps being a laid-back guy with laissez-faire sensibilities who doesn't like enforcing rules any more than he likes obeying them didn't help. And so I began reflecting back on my own law school experience. And as I thought about it, I realized that I had only had 2 professors at Virginia that were particularly Kingsfield-like. One was my contracts professor, a fellow named Bob Scott. Brilliant teacher. His command of the classroom was amazing. He was a magician. He could hide the ball so completely you had no idea if it was even still in the same universe you were, and then pull it out from behind your ear where it had been all along. But then as I started thinking about it, the courses I took in the second and third year of law school, Scott did most of the talking. The other Kingsfield-like professor I had at Virginia was my torts professor, who should remain nameless. His idea of snappy Socratic dialogue was to respond to every student comment with either, "So what?" or "Who cares?" Imagine, if you will, Socrates with Tourette's syndrome. The only thing I learned in his class was that the Coase theorem answered every question, which admittedly has served me well. Instead of Kingsfield, what I've gotten in law school was mostly what I've come to call soft Socratic. Instead of cold calling students, they used panels of students who are on call for a few days per semester. Instead of grilling a specific student at length, each student would be tossed a few questions, and then the professor moved on to the next. Students were never told they had given a wrong answer, let alone told, "Here's a dime, go and call your mother and tell her you will never be a lawyer." At most, the professor gently guided the student towards the proper conclusion. In my early years at Illinois, I frequently sat in on classes that were taught by colleagues who were supposedly these great Socratic teachers. Oddly, however, I noticed that in those classes, Socrates was doing all the talking. Just as at Virginia, the dominant pedagogic style was soft Socratic. In preparing this lecture, for example, I went back and dug out an evaluation I wrote at one of my Illinois colleges. I said, his style is very soft Socratic. He tosses an occasional question out there and waits for answers. If nobody responds, he answers them himself. At least he got the right answer. And in fairness, back in those days, you could have said much the same thing about my question style. You see, I was not then and never would be Kingsfield. But I was trapped in this mindset that no self-respecting law professor could use pedagogic techniques other than the Socratic method. And so I too became a soft Socratic teacher. And I hated it. Doubts kept intruding. Were the students who were not at all prepared? What were they getting out of listening to a colleague struggle with a question when I just moved on? Now, it's said that the Socratic method teaches students how to think like lawyers, and maybe the Kingsfield version does. I'm not sure the soft Socratic does. Moreover, the claim that the Socratic method does that would require some evidence. We know that in most other countries, lawyers are taught using lecture rather than the Socratic method, and presumably lawyers in those countries think like, lawyers. Right? So somehow they learn. Thinking like a lawyer is a matter of learning how to analyze and argue. But why think one does this by being grilled Socratically as opposed to reading examples of lawyerly thinking and hearing lectures explaining lawyerly arguments? I eventually came to two conclusions. First, if students couldn't think like lawyers by the time I got them in the second or third year, and for reasons that have puzzled me, no one ever lets me teach first year. But leave that as it may, by the time they get to me, if they can't think like lawyers, about the only thing I can do is suggest they take up another line of work. Secondly, the Socratic method doesn't really teach you to think like a lawyer, it teaches you to think like a litigator. Consider a typical law student who's going to go out in a transactional job at a large law firm. She spent 95% of her time in law school reading cases and being asked questions like, what was the procedural posture of the case? Why did that matter? What do you think about the case? Once in practice, she will go days or weeks at a time without picking up a case or law review article. She may go months without going to the library or even turning on Lexis. Instead, her days will be filled with drafting, reviewing, and marking up transactional documents, negotiating language with opposing counsel, sitting in on conference calls, composing memos, emails, and letters. Thinking like a lawyer, as Kingsfield and his ilk would have our graduate do, is not very conducive to success in that environment. In his book, The Terrible Truth About Lawyers, a book that is sadly out of print, but which I would encourage every one of my business students to find in the used book market and read, Mark McCormick, founder of the International Management Group, a major sports agency, wrote that, quote, it's the lawyers who, one, gum up the works, two, get people mad at each other, and three, make business procedures more expensive than they need to be. And now and then, deep six, what it seemed like a perfectly workable arrangement. McCormick further observed that, quote, when lawyers try to horn in on the business aspects of a deal, the practical result is usually confusion and wasted time. He concluded, quote, the best way to deal with lawyers is not to deal with them at all. That's a very sad commentary, and it's a particularly sad commentary for transactional lawyers. All of which is why I decided a long time ago to emphasize not only doctrine, but also economics, and more importantly, business, to understand the business backstory of what's going on in the cases. It's not the cases that interest me so much, as it is what happened before the case, and how the parties are going to respond now that this case is out there. How are they going to change their business practices?